we are now going to ask Dereck Milburn to take us back to right where we started, to bring back all of these principles that we learned through the afternoon back into an integrated management plan. Dereck has led the development of more than 25 protected area management plans in South Africa, and he's been involved all over Africa with the development of management plans. I think Dr. Ogilvy will say that the most important thing about him is that he studied at TUT, and I will say the most important thing is that he is the CEO of the LCA. Dereck, thank you very much I know you had also a long day. Thank you for coming in and doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
Great. So Johan basically tasked me with just providing an overview of the integrated management planning process for protected areas. Just my background, I'm not an ecologist, so the previous presenters would know a lot more about specific species and individuals and how to manage them the best. But this is just really to encapsulate everything and talk about how we present these alien invasive species management plans in a bigger perspective of integrated management planning for protected areas, how it responds to legislation locally, and just generally how it all works together. So it's basically going to be a flow of different documents forming part of the bigger IMP, and just the process of how we get to an integrated management plan. So as Johan mentioned, I've been involved with IMPs for some time. I did a lot of work in KZN, did a lot of work in Mpumalanga, and as he mentioned, I'm a very proud product of TUT. So it's great to see a lot of TUT people here, and it's wonderful to be part of it. So from an IMP point of view, an integrated management plan, without an IMP, alien invasive plant management would be reactive rather than strategic and may fail to meet South Africa's legal obligations. So off the bat, I think we've got to understand that without an IMP in place for any protected area that is declared, very often it's a reactive approach to any management interventions, not just alien plants, but specifically on an alien plant level. So this picture was taken just outside of Middelburg in President's Rus. That's our project manager at one of our parks. You can see he's absolutely at his ends. And that was with the hyacinth infestation that we were dealing with there, coming into the Loskop Dam Nature Reserve, which is one of the projects that we're really involved in terms of co-management agreement. So there's obviously certain scenarios where there will have to be reactive responses to these things when there's an event like this, where there's a crisis. But generally speaking, an IMP and integrated management plan should really drive your thinking and planning for a 5 or now 10-year period, generally speaking. So I'm just going to use one of the reserves today as an example, just for the purpose of the discussion. So I'm going to be talking about Loskop Dam Nature Reserve as a case study. Loskop Dam Nature Reserve is located in the Mpumalanga province, northeast of Pretoria, north of Middelburg. And basically, Loskop Dam Nature Reserve is located in a cluster of reserves. So you've got Loskop, Mabusa, SS Kosana, Mdala Nature Reserve, and Mkombo Dam Nature Reserve, which eventually we could join to form a bigger reserve. The reserve has got, the reason why I wanted to use this as an example is that you've also got an aquatic issue where you've got a 3,500 hectare dam, which is filled by both the Olifants and the Volga River, which comes with its own complexities. And the reserve itself is 23,500 hectares. To put it into perspective, so Middelburg sits here and Groblersdal basically sits on the top end here. And that's where the location is. Very often when you talk about Loskop Dam, people think about the Loskop Dam Forever Resort, which is located here, but it's a much bigger property. The reserve, obviously, like I've mentioned, it's got both the aquatic and the terrestrial components. So when you're looking at alien invasive, it does give you that variable, and obviously different legislation applies to the different components of these aspects in the reserve. So just an overview of integrated management plans. Integrated management planning is a strategic process that guides the protection, conservation, and sustainable use of protected areas. The management plan ensures that ecological, social, economic, cultural, and governance objectives are integrated into a single planning framework. So with all the protected area managers on the call today, I don't need to tell you this, but all of these activities that we have in a reserve should be guided by an overarching document, which is the integrated management plan. And then we have all of these different plans that basically stem from this overarching framework. And this framework basically guides us from a legislative point of view to ensure our compliance. So the end result is a management system which brings all management activities together in a single implementable framework whilst ensuring the input of stakeholders and aligning with legal requirements. So in these integrated management plans, when we are developing integrated management plans for reserves, it is critical that stakeholder engagement takes place throughout the process, and that's both for your primary stakeholders, which is your landowners within the reserve, which I'll go through a bit later, your management authorities, NGOs that are working in those reserves, and then you get obviously your secondary stakeholders, which are your interested and affected parties that are either interested or affected by whatever you do in the reserve. So this is basically all an indication of all the activities in a reserve and how we need to pull this all together under a single document to ensure that we can manage our budgets effectively and to make sure that we're on par with our objectives and making sure that our timelines are being adhered to. In terms of the legal context, and this is probably the most important part of integrated management planning and making sure that we understand the context. So obviously, in terms of the Constitution of South Africa, it provides every person with the right to an environment that is unharmful and requires protection of biodiversity for present and future generations. And that obviously has a direct reflection on the management of alien and invasives. Then you've got the National Environmental Management Act, which establishes environmental management principles, including sustainable development, cooperative governance, and integrated decision-making. And then the key item when you're looking at the legislative approach to integrated management plans is your National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act, which really dictates on what these plans look like, how we develop them, and really what components go into these IMPs. So there's a very set structure for these integrated management plans across the country, and they very often look very similar in terms of the structure. Obviously, different consultants and different protected area planning entities use probably different formats, but most of the time they all look very similar across the country. And then you've obviously got, which really relates to the alien invasive side of things, is the National Environmental Management NEMBA Biodiversity Act. It requires the prevention, monitoring, and control of alien invasive species and promotes biodiversity conservation through management planning. And then alien and invasive species areas regulations require management authorities to monitor, control, and where feasible, eradicate listed invasive species within protected areas. So there's obviously a lot more legislation which could apply to protected areas depending on where you are. But generally speaking, this is your legal context, which would reflect specifically on integrated management planning, and then obviously with your alien invasives, and that's what guides the IMP process. However, very often planners forget about important processes that happen in parallel to integrated management planning and to reserve management plans, generally speaking. So in the case of Loskop, you've got the terrestrial environment where the reserve is, but you've also got the dam. And as per any protected area needs a integrated management plan, any dam in the country also needs a resource management plan. So now you've got two planning processes running parallel, but they definitely talk to each other. So it's important that as planners and protected area managers, that you ensure that you get as much information and input into these plans as well as possible. Because very often they forget about how do we manage alien invasives on the dams, and there's not much detail on those components. So it's important that as planners we engage with these processes. So for example, in the case of Loskop Dam, we've got the MTPA, which is the Management Authority, the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency. They are the management authority, and they're responsible for recreational use and general management of the surface of the dam. But Water Affairs is responsible for the dam itself. So now you've got technically two different management authorities, and how do these management authorities talk to each other to make sure that we're addressing issues like water hyacinths on the dam. So it's quite important that we keep in mind that there are parallel processes that we need to engage with as protected area planners. In addition to that, which is very relevant I know the previous speaker also spoke about water hyacinths. So often we, as protected area managers and planners, you often think about the reserve that you have, and you're very specific within your boundaries and your neighbors. But we forget about the impact that comes from upstream and in our surroundings. So in a scenario like Loskop Dam that we're seeing at the moment, the impact there is from quite far away. Loskop Dam is no different. And therefore, you need to also consider the integrated development plans for your relevant municipalities, your local municipalities around your reserves. And not just reviewing those plans and making sure that you're trying to comply with them, but also actively providing input into these IDPs. So register as an interested and affected party in the IDP planning process and drive as much as you can to try and get your alien invasive programs in place within these IDPs, because from a regional perspective, that's where the impact needs to happen. And unless you, as a protected area or a protected area manager or a planner, are actively going to push that agenda, it's very seldom that that anybody is really going to care about alien invasive planning on a regional level. So it's important that we consider those parallel processes in a regional context. And obviously in the IMP, in the Integrated Management Plan, we talk about all of these documents and how they interact with the Integrated Management Plan. But we need to take it a step further and actively get engaged in these IDPs and the resource management plans in that scenario. So in terms of the legal framework that I spoke about a slide ago, that legal framework requires that an integrated management plan must identify alien and invasive plant threats, set measurable control objectives, prioritize high-risk areas for clearing, allocate budgets and responsibilities, monitor the effectiveness of control programs, and ensure compliance with NEMBA and the AIS regulations. So this is not a nice to have, this is not a optional, these are legal requirements in terms of the relevant legislation, and it's important that we all understand that. Is that we legally mandated to ensure that we address these components in the integrated management plan. Obviously, there's always challenges with the actual execution of your management objectives, your priority projects due to lack of resources and capacity often. But as long as we've got that in the IMP and we're actively showing that we've got some sort of push to get those objectives in place, that's at least that we can do to try and ensure that we are compliant with the legal framework. So looking at integrated management plans and how alien AIS programs fit into the integrated management plan. So there's different components, so I'm just going to go through it. The integrated management plan consists of, firstly, your legal context, which really defines all of your legislation. Obviously, I've mentioned 4 or 5 relevant legislation to today's talk, but there's a whole lot more that we need to take into consideration. We need to look at things like servitudes, which are important. Across reserves, there's a host of different legislation which is relevant. The next step is looking at your purpose, the significance, the vision, and objectives. So basically setting the context of the reserve, why you're managing it, why it is significant, why is it even there, and then the vision and the objectives, because that really defines the next step. Then there's really 3 components to the IMP, which starts bringing more action projects and programs into place. So it's the zoning plan, which really determines what you can do where, and I'll talk about that shortly. It talks about your tourism master plan in terms of how you utilize the reserve from a tourism point of view. And then it talks about your management plan, which really spells out your management objectives and the action projects on a section by section basis, which will include your alien vegetation. And then that all gets tied into your strategic implementation plan, which really defines each action project linked to timeframes, budgets, who's responsible, and indicators in terms of what has been achieved. And then on an annual basis, you have an annual plan of operations and a budget attached to the annual plan of operations. Now, I do understand this is in an ideal world, this is great if you've got all the money in the world and everything happens the way it should. But very often there are gaps in these annual plans of operations. A lot of the reserves, the state-owned reserves, have these annual plans of operations, but they can't always implement most of these plans due to budgetary constraints, which we need to be aware of. So very often these IMPs are in place, but there are gaps in terms of how do we actually execute them, which is a challenge in its own. Historically, the the integrated management plan had a 5-year review period attached to it. That is now a 10-year review period attached to it, where you review the integrated management plan legally every 10 years. Obviously, as a reserve, you can determine rather we want to do it every 5 years, and that's up to you as a reserve. But as a norm and a legal requirement, that is a 10-year review period as it stands. So this is just to give you an indication of what the zoning plan looks like. I'm not going to go through each individual zone, but basically we use the conservation development framework model, which was developed by Sandparks many years ago. And it really talks about high intensity leisure zones, wilderness zones. So for example, the red there is a high intensity leisure zone, which really has different activities which can take place in these zones. For example, lodges, what size lodges, your wilderness zones, no motorized activities. So it really just dictates what can happen where in your reserve. Now, the underlying component of your zoning plan is really relevant in terms of your sensitivity analysis. But you push up all of your sensitivity analysis layers under that, and that really determines your zoning as you go forward. And then on top of that, spatially, you then bring in your tourism master plan, which is a second component. And that really dictates on what activities you can develop where, and that's often how your concessions are issued out. So it's a very important document, this. So very often reserves that haven't got an integrated management plan are not allowed to start with concessioning processes, and this is specifically in state-owned reserves. So these documents are critical to unlock development in these reserves, and also to really get budgets approved for things like alien and invasive species. Very often governments don't really like funding projects if there isn't an IMP approved for these projects, and also getting donor support is quite challenging as well. A key issue in many of our reserves, which I think it's important to take note of as managers and planners, is the changing land ownership base in South Africa. So in many of our reserves, so let's just take Mpumalanga as an example. So 4 of the reserves in the entire Mpumalanga province don't have any land claims on them. All of the rest of the reserves are either completely claimed or they are percentage claimed. And many of those properties have been restituted back to those communities. Now, that happens through a settlement agreement and a co-management agreement. So when the land is given back to the communities, what we call a communal property association, it's a settlement agreement that determines how that land is given back. And because those properties are based or located within an existing protected area managed by a management authority, they sign a co-management agreement with that management authority to say, we grant permission for the management authority to manage our land within this reserve. But that brings its own level of complexities to ensure that landowners actually form part and parcel of the planning in terms of alien invasive planning, and also getting involved in the eradication of those alien invasives. So as an example, Loskop has got 3 different communities that own 22% in total. And these CPAs are now actively involved in the planning of the reserve, all of our activities in the reserve. Just so that as context, we recently signed a 25-year co-management agreement, the first of its kind in South Africa for this property. And we are actively working with these CPAs to give us labor, training in terms of alien invasives, how do they get involved. So this is going to become an increasingly important component of what we do in protected area management in South Africa. There's a lot of conflict on this basis, and it's important that we know how to deal with it. And in my opinion, alien and invasive management and eradication is one of the key ways that protected area managers can engage with those CPAs by granting labor and generating income for these CPAs. So I just wanted to make sure that we're aware of that, and that protected area managers understand that complexity as we go along. So in many cases, there's a lengthy process when we're developing integrated management plans. So very often in the first phase, often consultants are appointed to do this work. In some entities, there's an internal planning entity that can plan parks within organizations. Like I think Sandparks have got their own planning entity, whereas in other reserves, like in the provincial areas, they appoint consultants. We then look at project outline and encumbrance survey. So that's basically just starting to understand what do we need to achieve, what are the challenges in terms of CPAs, any other challenges that we need to identify and try and address before we start the process. We then look at the objectives of the reserve. We then start developing research and information generation, getting as much information as possible to make informed decisions. And then comes the integrated management, zoning, and institutional planning, where we actually go through the process. And that's engaging with stakeholders, getting draft documents out for review, getting comments on those draft documents, and then coming up with final documents, which are then taken to the MECs of the provinces for approval. So it's very much a tiered approach, and the final product has to be approved by the provincial authorities to ensure that the IMP is sanctioned. So in any IMP, you've got the vision, and in any way you look at it, alien and invasive species management will somehow align with your vision if you're doing it correctly. And then obviously in your objectives, there's like, for example, objective 3 to restore and rehabilitate where possible the natural environment. So there's always going to be ways to link alien invasive species management to your objectives in terms of your management objectives. So looking at the meat of your management plan, the details. So I've just taken this section out of the IMP for Loskop Dam Nature Reserve. So the challenge with a lot of these plans is that they are done at a very high level. So there's not a lot of detail, and just basically covers the core issues that need to be addressed. And then it's about the next level, which is very important that we get right. So you'll see, it just really covers things very broadly. But then the next step is looking at action projects, which says identify and document prevalence of alien species and their distribution within the reserve, develop and implement alien species monitoring and control program, and annually review the alien species monitoring and control program. So these action projects come at the end of each of these sections, and then they get pulled through to your strategic implementation plan. So the challenge is that in many cases, these IMPs stop here. So basically it looks great. We've got the alien plants in place, often the alien plants and alien animals. As we know, you've seen all of the presentations to this afternoon. It's extremely complex. There's so many different species, different programs, but very often this is all you see in an IMP. And if you as a protected area manager don't take it to the next step, this is where it often gets stuck. So it's important that we start pushing to take it to the next level. In terms of the strategic implementation plan, which is the next step, so we take those action projects and put them into the IMP, the strategic implementation plan. And you'll see here all the action projects are listed, the timeframes. This is still on a 5-year basis. Priority, the reserve then determines the responsibility, who's responsible for it, the indicators, deliverables, and the funding requirements. So often the reserve managers then need to fill out these funding requirements once they've done their business plans for the year. But that's how it goes to the next level. So it's important now as the protected area manager to take it to the next level and then start with your invasive species control and eradication plan, which has already gone into a lot of detail today. So I'm not going to go into those details specifically, but this is the next step. To look at your specific areas, the location of your alien invasives, the different categories and the priorities of these species, along with how you're actually going to control them, your control methods. And that's basically how what a plan would look like, generally speaking, attached to an IMP. Now, like I mentioned previously, IMPs look at strategic management plans or strategic management interventions, but there's always going to be curveballs thrown at you. This is in the event which we experienced last year, January, where we had a massive influx of hyacinths into the Loskop Dam Nature Reserve. And it took us about 2 months to eradicate pretty much 100% of the hyacinths. But in order to do that, you need a very strong team and a lot of resources. So we had the whole community involved. I think we had like 70 people from the community jumping in, spraying, removing alien invasives or the hyacinths. But throughout that process, the regional ecologist kept track of the hyacinths occurring in the dam, and we were constantly developing programs basically on a daily basis as to how we're going to address the movement of the hyacinths. And basically over the next 2 months, we did that process throughout. So you can see the changing of the maps there. And eventually we got to a point where there was basically nothing left to remove. So you can see we started there on the 9th of January by identifying the issue, that there was an event where the hyacinths were coming into the dam. And then the next report was on the 13th of January. So you can see the change there. And that's just a very good way to track what we did, how we did it. And from a GIS perspective, it helped a lot as well. That's the 3rd of February. You can see the difference there. And then by the 9th of May, basically, we had pretty much removed 99% of the hyacinths, and that's basically what was covered there. So although that is reactive, it's important to log this. And still, these are all little plans in place to show what has to happen in the next coming days when these crisis events happen on an ongoing basis. Then what's important to note is that the IMP then talks to the management effectiveness tracking tool, which I think has already been addressed in the presentations today. So this, just to give you an indication, if you look on the left, these are all the reserves in the Mpumalanga province that were done, that have had MET assessments done. And you can see the scores are fairly low throughout. With our management agreement with Loskop Dam, over the last 5 years, they've scored fairly low. We signed the agreement in 2024, and they scored 52% in their MET assessment. And with our agreement in place, we then scored 65% last year, and we're hoping to get a 75% MET assessment scoring next year in the new financial year. The point I'm trying to make there is a large reason why this percentage has gone up is because we've really focused on the alien invasive species management. So when we took the project on, it stopped at the IMP level, where we said that we need to develop a management plan, there needs to be monitoring done, there needs to be a GIS maps done. And you can see that from there, we've actually developed all of those plans. We've done a lot of the mapping, and we've done quite a lot of clearing as well. And that has had a direct impact on our MET assessment scoring. So if you look at the rest of the province, we are way above that. The only one that's equivalent is Barberton. But many of these other reserves don't have the alien invasive species planning that we do at Loskop. So it's just to show you what impact it can make when you're looking at your MET assessment scoring for your provincial reserves. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the IMP process, how all the documents fit together, and tying it off with a MET assessment and a real case example of when we're working with MET assessments and alien invasive species, how they can actually affect your MET assessment rating. Johan, I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Dereck. That was right on time and actually an amazing summary of what happened throughout the afternoon. You've been involved with so many development of so many plans. Where do things go wrong? And I know that you pointed there at one point where you really have to push things. But is that general? What does it mean to push things beyond that point? How do you fix that? What gets stuck there, and how do you get it beyond that point? Is that basically a lack of energy or a lack of participation? Yeah. How do you get people beyond that point?
So, Johan, it's a very good point, and it's a systemic issue that we have in South Africa, generally speaking, because as we know, provincial conservation agencies often get the scraps of budgets for the province, and they're always hamstrung in terms of budgets and support and capacity. So, the reserves can't even imagine implementing alien invasive species control program. They just haven't got the capacity and the resources. So I think it is an energy thing. It is a mindset thing. Often the reserve managers have given up to a certain degree just because they're not getting the support that they should be getting, generally speaking. But I think it's up to us as conservationists to start driving that. And that's exactly where it falls apart, because budgets are provided to develop the management plans, and often they're used as door stoppers. So where we have really made an impact is with this agreement with Loskop. We actively going through the IMP, we actively implementing these action projects on an ongoing basis. We meet once a month, and we're really driving this process. We actively involved in all of the regional platforms, like the Middleburg Chamber of Commerce. We're on all the water forums. We active everywhere on these platforms, and that's just to keep driving the momentum. Because if every one of these projects needs a champion. If you don't have a champion, it's going nowhere. And that's what I want to appeal to all of the the students on the call today, on the meeting today, is really to drive it, because it's up to you. It's not going to happen on its own. And I've seen it too many times where the reserve managers just have given up. And somehow you've got to fund in yourself to continue with that, with the planning. And don't wait till you get the budget. Find the support. Go and find funding. Us as an NGO, we often trying to find budget for these programs. We go and we speak to the ARC. We get the biological control because MTPA might not have the budget to go and fetch it, so we fetch it for them. The teams are very keen to get it done, but without the right support, it just doesn't happen. But what I do want to do on appeal again to the students on the meeting today is really to drive it. You are the champions of these protected areas, but it is tough out there. You're going to go out there and you're not going to have the resources you think you do. Your fences are going to be collapsing. The roads are going to be damaged, but somehow you've got to make it work. And it's really tough out there in South Africa at the moment. And if you look at, and it's not just in Mpumalanga, most of the provinces, and there's been study after study being done. And it's clear that the reserves are collapsing. So we need to start pushing. We need to start finding the right partners. We need to start finding external funders and make it work. It's not going to do it for you.
Yeah. Dereck, thank you so much for that dose of reality, but at the same time, that is inspirational. It's really in your hands, and you can see where it's being driven by the local manager, and you can just see those reserves stand out. Also, I'm thinking of Klipprivisberg Nature Reserve, where there is already that mechanism of the association that's ready to support the reserve, which is amazing. So those associations that are supporting particular reserves become really, really important and a nice resource for managers to have as support.
Yeah, and Johan, I think just lastly, in many of these reserves, and we actually had quite a big discussion today with our board about it, because we're really focusing on provincial nature reserves in South Africa now. We're going to push hard on that agenda. But as an example, Reefclan Nature Reserve here in Pretoria, which we've discussed, the rhino management there. We've been supporting that reserve for the last 10 years in their rhino management, dehorning, collars, LPR cameras. And that's all being funded by local capital, local businesses. You go to the local spa, you go to the local tire company to get tires for the vehicles. It's like it takes that level of engagement with your partners to really make a difference. And very often it takes that lateral thinking to actually make it work. So yeah, it's really tough out there. But private sector in South Africa needs to step up. They need to come to the party. It's all of our heritage. And, especially in these urban environments, Klipprivisberg is a good example. You've got a lot of capital around you. We should be engaging with those businesses to drive investment, to drive financial support. And those reserves should be self-sustaining.
Dereck, thank you so much. I just want to see there is a message in the chat. Nikita, who's saying, thank you so much, Dereck, for mentioning that the students need to take things into their own hands. There is so many reserves where our WIL students are based, and they are all facing those issues. And it's something that I'm trying to get across to the group, that they need to take things in their own hands. So thank you for bringing that message through. It's tough, but there is support. And the nice thing is that, it's in your hands, really. And we and the university, we are there to help you. And all these people that came in today's course to really assist you in equipping you to be ready for the job ahead. We're all available there to support you. So, take the opportunity.
Absolutely.
With that, I think I'm going to thank everybody for their participation.
So the question is, how do you assess whether your management plan remains relevant under changing environmental and socio-economic conditions?
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. So again, an IMP, the purpose of an IMP is very much overarching. So, it gives you those broad brushstrokes in terms of what needs to happen. So technically, it shouldn't change too much over that period, but the details change. And that's why you have your annual plan of operations. So that then guides you in terms of what you're doing on an annual basis. And then you can also review your plan every year if you want as a protected area manager. You don't necessarily always have to do the 10-year official review. So it is a challenging thing because the IMP is a legislated plan. It's legislated in terms of how it's developed. It's legislated in terms of how it's used. But you as a manager in a protected area, it's up to you to really adapt your program to achieve those objectives. And you'll determine that on an annual basis. Like with us as well, you know, with the reserves that we're supporting, we sit down every year and we say, well, we would love to do all of this, but it's not possible right now with the budget. Secondly, to give you an example, which was shocking, I'm not going to mention the reserve name, but I had 16 million rand to put into a fence. And we couldn't get the CPAs, who are the landowners within the reserve, to talk to each other, and they threatened to take the fence down. So we had the money, we had the capacity, we wanted to get it done within a year. We had a year to do it, and we couldn't get the community to engage properly. They weren't set up properly, they weren't engaged. So that completely stifles your plans. So you're always going to have these curveballs. And yes, you're going to swallow big pills. Losing 16 million rand, that money is gone, and so is the fence. But now we've got to recover it. But it's going to change all the time. So although the IMP is a 10-year review period, you as a manager should be reviewing it annually in terms of what you want to achieve, and that filters down into your annual plan of operations.
Tumi, thank you for the question. All right, with that, I see Valdo and Nick and Zanele and Navashni, you're all still in. We really appreciate your time this afternoon.